afternoon's panels. We're so happy to have all of you here and all of you who have been participating. Um, as you know, the goal of the conference has been to take an interdisciplinary approach to this really complex problem. And so I am really happy to be able to chair a panel who will give us insights from the perspective of practicing psychologists. I am Susan St. Ville. I work at the Kroc Institute on the University of Notre Dame, where I direct the Masters in International Peace Studies program. I'm also a clinician in private practice in the local community where I work extensively with survivors of trauma, and in the past have worked also with offenders of sexual abuses. So I have a very deep interest in this issue. What I'm going to do is introduce all of our participants, and then we'll go forward so that you can hear their papers. First and foremost, we have Dr. Susan Fethergill, who is a licensed clinical psychologist who graduated from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Dr. Fethergill has worked in a variety of inpatient and outpatient treatment centers. She specializes in the treatment of depression, anxiety, and trauma, using an integrative approach that incorporates spirituality and mindfulness with a range of trauma-focused psychotherapeutic models. In her practice currently, Dr. Fethergill provides psychological testing to assess seminary candidates for the priesthood and is a member of the Diocesan Review Board for the Fort Wayne South Bend Diocese. Dr. Fethergill has served as adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame, where she taught Introduction to Pastoral Care and Counseling. And along with Dr. Jeff Fethergill, she provides an annual training to seminarians in premarital counseling at the North American College in Rome, Italy. Our second speaker will be a virtual speaker, and that is Brother John Mark Falkenhayn, who is a Benedictine monk of St. Meinrad Archabbey in southern Indiana. Brother John Mark earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from St. Louis University and is also a licensed clinical psychologist. He is a faculty member of the St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology and a fellow in human formation with St. Luke Institute. Since joining St. Meinrad in 2002, Brother John Mark has served his community as vocation director, assistant formation director, and has spent several years conducting psychological evaluations for candidates for the priesthood, diaconate, and religious life. He is a frequent lecturer in the US and abroad on topics related to religious and priestly formation, formation for celibate chastity, perseverance in religious life, and clergy sexual abuse. Brother John Mark is the author of the book, How We Love, A Formation for the Celibate Life, published by the Liturgical Press. And last but not least, we have Father Ken Schmidt. Father Schmidt is a priest in the Diocese of Kalamazoo, where he serves as the advocate for priestly ministry and support. He has a master's degree in counseling psychology from Western Michigan University, along with multiple other degrees, and he is a licensed professional counselor. Father Ken is founder of the Trauma Recovery Program in his diocese and co-founder and clinical director of Trauma Recovery Associates. Trauma Recovery Associates educates and fosters the development of organizational leaders, human service providers, and trauma survivors themselves to respond more effectively to the impact of childhood trauma. It has trained in 23 states and 7 countries and provides programs for childhood trauma survivors throughout Southwest Michigan. Father Ken has published in the areas of canon law, pastoral theology, psychology, and spirituality, including a book about trauma and spirituality, as well as a book on the Psalms for those recovering from addictions. So as you can see, we have a wonderful panel that we are going to hear from, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Fethergill.
Thank you, Susan, and thank all of you who are here. It is an honor to be participating in this conference. So I'm going to talk about lessons from psychologists for ministry to the church. And I'd like to speak about the role of psychologists in helping with the tasks of accountability and healing in response to the sexual abuse of persons by clergy in the Catholic Church. By way of introduction, I want to share that I first became aware of the healing of sexual trauma when I was working on my master's thesis in psychology at the University of Cincinnati in the mid-1980s. I was introduced to the literature by reading some of the pioneers such as Judith Herman, Suzanne Segroy, and Nicholas Groth. And I remember feeling astonished then and even now when I learned that at the time, 1 out of 4 women in the United States have experienced some type of unwanted sexual touching or sexual abuse in their lifetime. That's really an astonishing number of people. Throughout my graduate training, the issue of trauma continued to be of interest, and after becoming a psychologist, my work progressed in treating both children and adults who suffered from some form of trauma, including sexual abuse. Jumping ahead to 2002, I was asked to provide evaluations for seminary applicants for a religious community in Chicago and have continued to provide such evaluations here in South Bend. As reports of sexual abuse by Catholic priests continued to be revealed, an effort was made to improve the screening of seminary applicants and note possible red flag concerns. The work of Dr. Thomas Plant and many others have helped to address this concern. So I'm going to say a little bit first about what are these psychological assessments and what do they include. We administer psychological tests that are helpful in understanding personality, characteristics, and in identifying mental health problems like depression, anxiety, and personality disorders. We include a comprehensive clinical interview that looks at the applicant's family of origin or family background, their interpersonal and psychosexual development, their intellectual and academic background, their skills in managing stress and self-care, and examination of risk factors for sexual misconduct. A thorough report of the analysis of the tests and the clinical interview is then given to a vocations office director, and then the psychologist provides follow-up with church officials and religious superiors to make sure that they understand any identified concerns or risk factors, and then even a feedback session with the candidate himself. So it's important to note that the evaluation process does a much better job of providing a description of the candidate's current and past issues and behavior than it does at predicting future problematic issues and behavior. The test can't be a crystal ball of prediction. Thus, the evaluation doesn't guarantee that the applicant will not cause sexual harm to others, but we believe that it's one important step towards safety and prevention of sexual abuse. There is, of course, need for ongoing work in developing improved methods of evaluation. So these evaluations that psychologists have facilitated for over 40 years are only one part of the Church's attempt to understand and respond to the psychological trauma of sexual abuse. So how else have psychologists been involved in their response to the trauma of sexual abuse? The Church, as you know, has established review boards, which include psychologists such as myself, lawyers, social workers such as Mary Glowowski, and other lay persons to provide consultation to the bishop and work as a group to help victims of clergy abuse with identification, investigation of the report of the accused clergy. And I would say we have a really good review board and a very responsive bishop who does listen to our consultation as a group. Psychologists have also collaborated with the Church to provide treatment of survivors and treat offenders of sexual abuse in their practices or in specialized treatment centers around this country and in Canada. Psychologists, along with pastoral ministers and priests, psychologists such as Dr. McGlone, offer scientific research, clinical practice, and education in an attempt to meet the needs of abuse victims and Catholics as a whole. Psychologists consult with bishops and priests who may already be having mental health problems and make referrals for treatment when the priest or seminarian needs support for mental health concerns. We provide educational training and workshops to priests and seminarians on how to maintain appropriate boundaries, how to recognize risk factors for behavioral problems, and even how to address and deal with challenging parishioners. So I'd like to share, changing topics a little bit, with you just a few of some of the research conducted by psychologists about the sexual abuse of minors or children or anyone who is under the age of 18 is defined as a minor, as we've heard. Most of the research on the sexual abuse of children in general did not emerge until the 1980s. Data regarding Catholic priests showed that the priests tended to be older in their late 50s in comparison to the general population of men who were engaged with sexually abusing persons of all ages. So the mean age was 53 for male priests at the time of the 2002 study. It was also noted that priests tended to have a higher IQ of about 125 in comparison to the general population of persons who were sexual offenders, who tended to have more in the average range. So that's just a statistic of the research. I also want to share some of psychology's understanding about the possible root causes of the sexual abuse by priests. Currently, understanding the causes also includes many misperceptions. So one common misperception includes blaming the priesthood's requirement for celibacy. No evidence indicates that Catholic priests are more likely than male clergy from any other religious traditions or men in general to sexually abuse adolescents or children. Indeed, many people who sexually abuse children are married, heterosexual adult men. And this was notable to me when doing the research on adult women who are sexually abused by their fathers or stepfathers for my thesis. Priests and other adult males who either choose to remain celibate or can't have a sexual relationship, maybe because of marital discord, don't necessarily target children or adolescents as the object of their sexual interest. They're more likely to target adults. Consequently, if the Catholic Church allowed priests to marry, it wouldn't decrease or eliminate the possibility of male clergy who are inclined to sexually victimize minors or adults. Another misperception includes that the clergy's sexual abuse problems are somehow related to homosexuality. The data show that sexual orientation does not predict sexual crimes against children and adolescents. Homosexual men are no more likely to engage in illegal sexual behaviors with children and adolescents than heterosexual men. Many men who've sexually abused children and teens identified themselves as heterosexual, while others identified themselves as being only sexually attracted to children, and that's the definition of a pedophile. So what does psychology teach us about confronting the trauma of sexual abuse in order to help with the healing process and prevent further sexual abuse? So we can identify risk factors associated with priests and clergy who have sexually abused young persons, with the hope of either preventing such persons from entering religious life and/or helping them to work through their own trauma before considering religious life. We know that priests and other religious clergy who abuse persons 18 and younger typically have a history of abuse themselves. 2002 research showed that about 70% of priests who have sexually abused children have also been sexually abused as children themselves. In addition, many clergymen have mental health and medical disorders, including major depression, anxiety and other affective disorders, personality disorders, and substance abuse problems, and medical issues such as seizure disorder. This data points to the urgent need to treat the psychological, medical, and spiritual needs of the clergy, which, when left untreated, can contribute to their sexually abusive behavior or other problematic behaviors, such as inappropriate sexualized questions of adult women in the confessional, or when providing spiritual direction to young adult women behaving in an inappropriate manner. So I've observed that some seminarians and priests are very open to the need for help when referred to psychotherapy, while others seem to perceive it as either a punishment or something they don't really need. So I know that pastors can strongly recommend treatment, and if refused, the pastors need to talk to the bishop, who does then enforce obedience. But I've also seen the priestly culture here sometimes not really wanting to tell the bishop, because this is my perception, they seem to think of it as kind of ratting out one of their own. I don't want to refer this person and tell them that they need psychotherapy when they don't think they do, and we're all priests and it's going to look bad, kind of thing. Another risk factor mentioned in some of yesterday's panels include the issue of the lack of a mature psychosexual development. Many priests entered the seminary before they've really reached mature psychosexual development, and for some men, living in a same-sex community environment may have further postponed their social, emotional, and sexual development. 50 to 60 years ago, most priests entered the seminary in high school, and they weren't required to complete a comprehensive psych eval prior to their admission. They had no training in sexuality issues, and still many don't, or in maintaining boundaries and impulse control. Dr. Thomas Plant noted that many young men were advised to take a cold shower and pray. That was their advice. On the other hand, men entering the priesthood currently tend to be in their late 20s or even early 30s on average, and more often than not have had previous mutual relationships, which I consider a strength for them, to have loved someone and to know what it's like to be in a loving relationship. Men already in seminary who have sexuality concerns or confusion about their own sexual identity tend not to feel comfortable talking to their formators about this issue because of the ambiguity regarding the church's stance on homosexuality. If a seminarian believes that by revealing that he is either homosexual or bisexual, he fears he'll be kicked out of the seminary or not even accepted as an applicant to the seminary. So I've seen a tendency for men to deny their sexual identity to themselves or remain confused about it for many years. I've treated a few seminarians who later became priests and then came back and said, I need to talk about these issues now. Now I feel comfortable doing that. So consequently, many seminarians and priests who were never taught to integrate their sexuality, regardless of their sexual identity, have had to kind of check it at the door. And many priests who are conflicted about their sexuality may also be in an emotionally immature state. And emotional immaturity happens to be one of the common characteristics of men who engage in inappropriate sexual behavior with adolescents, and I've seen who also engage in inappropriate behavior with adults. So I'm going to shift gears again. I want to mention a few of the ways that we as psychologists can help survivors. First, psychologists and other mental health professionals who provide psychotherapy, again, need to treat survivors with respect and compassion as we walk with them on a journey of healing and recovery through listening to their story, through maintaining a safe emotional holding environment for the person so that they can develop the coping skills to deal with the anxiety, the depression, the problems with trust in their relationships, and then all of the physical symptoms like hyperarousal, lack of a regular sleep pattern, avoidance of anyone or anything that reminds them of triggers or triggers to recall their abuse. And I have worked with a few of the survivors who have been sexually abused by priests, and they have said the priest collar and religious vestments are often triggers for those who have survived the abuse. And yet some of those people still stay in the Catholic Church. They still have the same beliefs. They still feel part of the body of Christ, which I think is remarkable. We as psychologists need to continue collaborating with pastors to help persons receive appropriate treatment and support. So we're not usually the first people that hear about treatment. Usually it's pastoral ministers or the pastors themselves are the first contact for trauma survivors to speak to. So in our parish at St. Pius X in Granger, the pastor, Father Bill, set up a voucher system by which he refers to 4 or 5 clinicians in the area, and the parish pays for the majority of the fee for the person, and the client has a $20 copay if they don't have insurance. One man who I worked with who survived sexual abuse by a family member told me that if Father Bill had not referred him to me, he would have never come for treatment or to the office. But after a year or so of the treatment, he said he would recommend therapy to others. It wasn't such a bad thing. He benefited from it. So psychologists so we need to collaborate with our pastors. They're the ones who are going to get people to treatment most of the time, I think. And with Mary Glowowski, who I really thank you for your work, that people do call her and she hears them, and then they do get some kind of help. Psychologists and other mental health workers need to provide ongoing training to support the clergy and to their formators about how to maintain professional and personal boundaries with children, teens, and adults. And I know we heard Bishop Rhodes agreeing with that. More in-depth training and consultation about how sexuality and boundary issues change and emerge throughout the life and career of a priest, I think would be beneficial. I know I'm getting close to time, but I do want to make mention of an article recently published by psychologist Dr. Len Sperry titled, "Psychotherapy Alone is Insufficient, Treating Clergy Sexual Abuse and Sacred Moral Injury." It was published by the American Psychological Association just last month, and so we emailed him just to get permission to read it. So if we get permission to send it, I can send it to David, but we don't have that yet. So I'm just going to do a little bit of summary of what he has to say, and I hope I do it justice. He conceptualizes the experience of sexual abuse by clergy as a sacred moral injury alongside of post-traumatic stress and betrayal trauma. Dr. Sperry described sacred moral injury as a form of moral injury characterized by the sacred betrayal of trust and the loss of a sense of the sacred. He describes a 5-step process of recovery for those who were sexually abused by clergy and includes the role of the mental health professional. He asserts that recovering from the trauma of sacred moral injury involves restoring the sense of the sacred. The abused person has experienced the betrayal of sacred trust by a priest, whom the abused person perceives as God's representative. Consequently, the loss of trust in God occurs in addition to the loss of trust in God's representative, the priest. Dr. Sperry furthermore asserts that recovering from the trauma of sacred moral injury includes recovering from the sacred betrayal and regaining trust in both God and God's representative. Furthermore, he points to the need for systemic change in the organizational structure, leadership, and culture of the institution of the church. Briefly, his 5 guidelines for recovery, and they don't have to be in this order, are listen, acknowledge, and validate, something we do as therapists, offer apology and facilitate forgiveness, provide effective psychotherapy treatment, facilitate atonement and compensation, and encourage organizational systemic change. I know there's a lot more that we can do, but this is a step. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we will hear from Brother John Mark, who I believe will be coming up right here.
Here he was.
Screen
There he
sharing.
was.
Okay.
All right, I just want to make sure that I can be heard. Could someone give me that feedback before I begin?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you. It's a real privilege. I'm sitting here in my office in St. Meinrad, and I hope that the weather up in northern Indiana is as beautiful as it is down here. It feels like spring leading to summer, although I'm sure more winter is on the way. Again, I'm a psychologist here at St. Meinrad. I was a psychologist before I joined our community about 20 years ago, and I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation today. When I introduce myself, I oftentimes start with this slide, which is the college church at St. Louis University, where I did my doctorate. And I emerged from St. Louis University with kind of 2 prongs of my professional life. I really trained to be a pediatric psychologist, meaning I worked a lot on the interface of psychology and medicine, working with kids with chronic and acute and sometimes terminal illnesses. But my doctoral dissertation was a look at clergy sexual offenders. And this was in 1994. And so it was pretty early on in people's growing awareness of the problem of child sexual abuse by clergy and religious brothers. And so it was a very interesting time. I always like to share this slide and provide a little story, which was I didn't really go to our graduation at St. Louis University, that sort of big occasion. It was long and I thought boring, but I did go to the hooding ceremony, which was the College of Arts and Sciences, which happens here in the college church. And they clear the altar platform and line up all the dignitaries' chairs. And the proceedings is that they would announce your name, and then as they read your dissertation title, your doctoral advisor would put the hood on you, and people would clap and walk off. And so that day, the proceedings went something like, George Dolan, a study of dolphins off the coast of South Africa, and people clapped, and he walked off. And Jennifer Engler, to study of mice with metabolic disorders, and people clapped and walked off. And then it was my turn, and they read Mark Falkenhayn, cluster analysis of the MMPI of Roman Catholic priests who are child sex offenders. And the response by the community was, it was just a collective gasp. And I got one bit of applaud, and I think that was from my mother as I kind of walked off. And But these two kind of prongs of my professional life have come together in a very interesting way for me. In that I do now at St. Meinrad and other places as well, other seminaries and religious communities, I do a lot of work in the area of formation for the celibate life and human formation in general. And it's been very helpful to have been a pediatric psychologist in the sense that we really think developmentally when working with children. What does it mean to move from a child who's 5 to 10 to 15 into adulthood? And formation is really a developmental word that we think about. How do we help someone move into an identity, a priestly identity, a religious identity, a celibate identity? And having done some research and work where that has gone wrong, and where the outcome has been problematic, I've really had a chance to devote my professional life really to trying to figure out how can we make that happen in a way that is healthy and really in line with what the church hopes for the celibate life. Certainly, as you've probably been talking about these last couple of days, is that the effects of clergy sexual abuse on the church have really several concentric levels of victimization, right? There's certainly the victim, him or herself, who is the primary victim. But then if we see sort of go out in levels of system, there's also the victim's family who suffers, as well as the parish community where this has taken place. And then it affects the diocese and it affects the larger church, right? And then all of these victims experience some emotional trauma, certainly betrayal, and anger and guilt, and disillusionment, and mistrust. And I think it's very interesting that while it gets more and more intense for the direct victim, I think every level of the church feels these things, right? As someone maybe who wasn't a direct victim, but as a member of the church, we feel disillusioned, and we really wonder if we can trust the formation systems in the church, if we can trust the church to handle things correctly, right? And I think even now, my dissertation was 30 years ago. This was really starting to grow in our attention in the last 40 years. And still many, I think, of these emotions remain unresolved for us as a church, and certainly for the individuals that have been affected most directly. In 1992, Father Stephen Rossetti, who was the president of St. Luke Institute at the time, came out with a book, and I don't know if many people remember it, but it was called Slayer of the Soul. It was one of the first publications about clergy sexual abuse. And he began this book with a little bit of a research study looking at the effects that this had on people's trust and credibility in the church. And he got a bunch of people to respond, some of whom had no experience within their parish or personal experience of clergy sexual abuse, then some experience within the diocese, and then experience within the parish. And he wanted to see how this affects people's trust in the church. And so he asked questions like, do you believe a priest's conduct should be better than other people's conduct? And you can see that it starts to erode away. Only 72 people who had a priest, or 72% of the people who had some offense in the parish really believed that a priest's conduct should be better. They were starting to become jaded. I looked to the Catholic priest to provide moral leadership. Still pretty high, but starts to decay. But then look at this. Would you trust a new priest assigned to your parish? Now, this is in 1992, right, which is 30 years ago. Already, even with no experience, 59% of the people only agree that they would trust a new priest. And if you've had clergy sexual abuse in your diocese or in your parish, it gets even below half, right? I look to the church to provide guidance on issues of human sexuality. Only 66% of the people who have had some somewhat direct experience believe that. I trust the Catholic Church to take care of problems with its clergy. This is really sobering, isn't it? 25%. I trust that the church takes care of problems with its clergy. And again, this is pre-explosion of 2000, late 90s. This is as early as 1992. I believe the church's current response to the problem of clergy sexual abuse is adequate. Now, this is disagree. So only 20% actually agree that the response is adequate back in 1992. And then finally, this is telling too. If I had a son, I would be pleased if he wanted to become a priest. So lots of implications for the church at large, right? Now, the question that we've been trying to answer this whole last several days, I believe, is how does the church heal? How does the church recover from this kind of trauma? It's been my experience that when working with children, and not necessarily children of sexual abuse, but children in general, when they've had the trauma of abuse or neglect, or even the trauma of an accident or a natural disaster, a couple of things are really, really important. The first is that a child and a person is really not going to begin their recovery until the threat is no longer an active threat, right? I remember seeing a little boy who was living in a very dangerous neighborhood. He's having lots of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we tried to treat the post-traumatic stress disorder, but the problem was he was still hearing gunshots all night long, and there were still reports of violence in his neighborhood. So it was really hard to help him move beyond something that was still very much an active threat into which he was responding. But then secondly, once the threat is no longer active, then there has to be some sort of intervention that assists the victims in reestablishing trust in the goodness of the world, in the goodness of the family, in the goodness of the parents, in the goodness, in our case, of the church, right? So let's consider these institutionally. We're not talking at this point about how do we restore individuals' trust and credibility, but how do we, in general, try to reestablish the trust that people have in the church, in the institution of the church following this trauma. Now, is this a threat that is no longer active? I'm going to say yes and no. This is a chart from the John Jay report that came out, I believe, in 2012. And as you may recall, the John Jay report really looked at trying to describe the who, the what, the why, the how of the clergy sexual abuse. And one of the things that they really found was that this is a chart looking at incidents of sexual abuse by year of occurrence, not by year of when it was reported, by year of occurrence. And what we see here is that the count of incidents per year, not per year, sorry about that, per year increased steadily from the mid-1960s through the 1970s, and then began to decline in the 1980s, and then continues to remain low. So what we get here is sort of a rise in the incidence of clergy sexual abuse from about 1960 into the kind of 1980s, mid-1980s, and then starts to come down. We have to consider this carefully. Does this mean that this is no longer a threat? A question that certainly it begs of me is, has it really declined? Or is this the effect of delayed reporting, knowing that lots of victims don't report abuse right away? The good news is that the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, or CARA, has continued to collect data on allegations made from 2003, when the John Jay report left off, to the present, and they're showing the same general curve. Now, something to note here is, in one way, the threat is less active. On the other hand, we still hear reports of it, we hear talk of it, and so it can still trigger a bit of a traumatic response for us in the church hearing about this. The other thing that I also want to add is I don't believe that we'll ever be at a place in which there is zero sexual abuse in the church by clergy or religious. It's wonderful that it's come down, but because the church is a human institution, I'm certainly not excusing it or anything, but I think we will always have some, and hopefully lower and lower and lower, experience of this from time to time. But in general, it has come down, and that's a really wonderful thing. Now, the question is, if we saw this pattern, why did it rise from 1960 to 1980, and why has it come down? This will be important in informing kind of how do we keep it down, and how do we continue to move forward in healthy ways. The John Jay report showed that there were really about 6 or 7 kind of factors that help to contribute both to the rise in the occurrence of clergy sexual abuse, and then also the decline into the 1980s, 90s, and more contemporary times. Those contributing factors were historical and cultural elements that were happening. The 60s, 70s, early 80s were a time in which, just in the general population and the general culture, it was a time of greater permissiveness, Lots of other deviant behaviors were on the rise. There are higher crime rates, higher rates of extramarital affairs, premarital sex, drug use. So this was a time when lots of kind of deviant behaviors were on the rise. They also point to the lack of helpful seminary education from the years leading up to this time, right? Not great experiences in terms of how to do celibacy formation. I think Dr. Fethergill was talking about, well, just pray it away and take a cold shower. When I asked the men in my community, what kind of celibacy formation did you get in the 1950s, 60s, 70s? And they told me, well, they just told us not to think about it. And I always wanted to, well, how did that work out for you? Then there are other things that have contributed to the rise in clergy sexual abuse, or certainly just the factors that cause clergy sexual abuse in the general population, right? What do we know about why people offend? But then there is also how that interacts with how the church responded. And so we know certainly now that the church could have done things better, right? That there was very little transparency. There was a frequent experience of moving someone from one church to another. It wasn't always reported. It wasn't always the most kind of pastorally helpful approach to things. And as a result, then the crises were perpetuated rather than being addressed in a more immediate and helpful way. There are also some factors related to how men abuse, and this includes clergy abusers. Often it involves grooming, it involves gaining trust, it involves great levels of secrecy, and sometimes coercion and threats, such as, you can't tell anyone. If you tell anyone, your parents are going to get in trouble. If you tell anyone, they're going to take you away from your parents. And the result of this, of course, is that the sexual abuse goes undetected for a very long time, where more and more victims end up getting involved. And so this perpetuates the cycle of abuse. And then finally, they point to situational factors, and in particular, kind of the lack of prevention policies. We didn't have great policies for reporting, great policies for supervising priests and children on outings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these are all very helpful to know. These are the coming together of lots and lots of variables that help to explain kind of this rise in the 1960s and 70s and 80s of clergy sexual offense. But these factors also help us to understand why it came down, right? So for example, I've got highlighted in orange here, the church's response really has improved, right? We're working much more on accountability and transparency. About every diocese, every religious community has long policies in terms of reporting and how we handle allegations, and having review boards and having greater transparency, right? Lots of prevention policies in terms of how we inform people, how we look for red flags, what we do when we see red flags, etc. As we said, knowing that the historical and social cultural variables played a part, that while yes, this was a time of rising kind of deviant behavior in the culture in general, the other thing was that in the early 1960s and 70s, nobody was really dealing with sexual abuse of children in the larger population, right? And so not until the 1960s do we begin to get some mandated reporting laws. And it's in the 1970s that we get the Child Protection Act that really starts to establish child protective services and offers structures for reporting, more and more reporting guidelines, and more laws around mandated reporting, which include priests and teachers and parents, et cetera, right? And so all of this helps then to address the problem, both in our larger culture and certainly within the church. And then finally, we can look to the research as to why people offend, and that helps us to then better tailor our screening and better tailor kind of the way that we form people for the priestly, the religious, and in particular, the celibate life, right? What do we know about clergy sex offenders? I told you my research was looking at using a cluster analysis of the MMPIs of about 100 clergy sex offenders. I'm really looking for subtypes of offenders, not assuming that all men who offend are the same. And the result of that study was that there are three primary types. And what's interesting is that these types also occur in the larger general population of child sexual offenders, but they're distributed quite differently among clergy. So for example, we get this first very small cluster, which there's a group of offending priests who are just really significantly psychiatrically disturbed. On the MMPI, they're up on depression, up on anxiety, up on psychosis, lots up on sexual problems. And what's interesting here is that among the clergy, there aren't many of these. So this probably indicates that to some degree, we did a pretty good job of screening out this type of offender, right? And the truth is you probably didn't need the MMPI to screen them out. These are people that as they came into your office, you looked at them and said, oh, there's just not something quite right about this guy. But then there's this group. Nearly half of the population of offenders are a group that really had long-term maladaptive personality styles that was characterized by narcissism, right? And probably the best way to think about narcissism is when a person considers himself or herself, but here himself, to be the sole reference when deciding what is right and what is wrong, no longer taking into account the perspectives of other people or the needs of other people when making decisions, right? And so the important thing to remember with narcissism is that the antidote to narcissism is accountability, right? When one has to perceive that they are accountable to other people. So all of these structures in the church around transparency and review boards and community support and challenges, all of this really helps to address this type of offender, right? But also being on the lookout for them, although they can be very difficult to screen out. And then finally, and I think really most interestingly, is this group that was nearly half of the clergy sexual offenders. And they were men who were not really high on lots of elevations on the MMPI. They didn't have long-term maladaptive personality problems. If you looked at their profile in MMPI, there were usually no elevations. But if you looked more closely, what you saw was that these were people who were simply sexually and emotionally underdeveloped, right? That they did not really reach a state of psychological, psychosexual maturity that they should have for their age. Now, this could be because they're not wanting to deal with their sexuality, or maybe they had suffered some sexual trauma as their own, as Dr. Fethergill had suggested. And so these people perhaps were motivated to a celibate life in order to not have to deal with something about themselves that might feel bad or shameful. And so it's possible that a celibate life could just kind of reinforce or enable them not to develop in a healthy way. And so the result of that is that our formation programs really do have to encourage people to grow and to make sure that people aren't coming to the celibate life for reasons that are unhealthy and avoidance oriented. Now, what are the implications? Well, we started talking about them. The implications for this research on screening and formation, as Dr. Fethergill pointed out, our screening is now much more standardized, right, and much more rigorous. Accreditation programs, for example, Presidium for men's religious communities, when screening men require criminal background checks and multiple personal and professional letters of recommendation and psychological evaluation, and that has to include the psychosexual history by a qualified person. We now have to do review of social media and blogs and personal websites, looking for anything that might indicate that this person might have some risk factors or might be engaging in behaviors that would suggest problematic psychological and psychosexual development. In addition, we have to have specific training for our vocations and formation personnel to help them to know how to look for problems related to sexual abuse. Human formation, the formation of the human being, has gained more and more emphasis with each edition of the program for priestly formation. If you look from the 1960s or 70s all through the current edition, which is the 5th and soon to be the 6th, human formation, the psychological formation of the priest becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger and greater concern, requiring more and more attention, and that's a good thing, right? Again, accreditation programs require that you have some sort of celibacy formation program at every stage of initial formation. And look at the wording there: specialized support and accountability. How do we encourage a sense of accountability in people, knowing that narcissism is a trait that leads to sexual abuse? In my own personal work in this area, as I was pointing out in my introduction, I wrote a book a couple of years ago, How We Love: A Formation for the Celibate Life, which is built around kind of four main content areas: looking at people's motives for the celibate life, making sure that they're healthy; looking at theological dimensions. Are they inspired for celibacy for spiritual and theological reasons? Looking at sexual identity, helping people to better understand and describe and articulate for themselves who they are as sexual and romantic people, so that we're not allowing people to come in and using celibacy as a way of avoiding sexual and emotional issues. And then finally, really training people in what are the skills for the celibate life, and all with kind of an overarching goal of having people grow in self-knowledge and self-acceptance of who they are before committing themselves to this life. Another example of my work in this area, and not just mine, but lots of people, is I work with St. Luke Institute in co-organizing a every other year conference on human formation that brings together vocations directors, formation directors, mental health professionals, spiritual directors, and priestly and religious formation. This one coming up soon in April is on practical models of celibacy formation. And here's a list of the workshops that will be offered: structuring a program for celibacy formating, screening for celibacy, addressing celibacy and spiritual direction, understanding the language of sexual identity, considerations for chastity formation with women, fostering transparency, navigating boundaries, teaching the theology of celibate chastity, celibacy formation in the propedeutic year, what should goals be there, dealing with histories of sexual trauma, and exploring motives for celibacy with candidates. So all of this is really informed, certainly by what the research is showing us are important things to be looking at. And hopefully this continues to help kind of keep new occurrences of sexual abuse by clergy and religious low. So as I said, recovery from trauma requires that the thread is no longer active or as active, that people are feeling like, okay, we're addressing this. And then finally, we need to have an intervention in the larger church that assists victims in reestablishing trust in the church, right? So an intervention that assists the church in general in reestablishing their trust in our institutional church. Now, I think I don't have time for this, and I hope that Father Ken will talk a bit about this, but I think what we really need at the parish level are programs that will help deal with those unresolved feelings of anger and betrayal and mistrust and hurt, right? And I think programs like this should really have two prongs. The first one should be that the first goal should just be to receive and acknowledge the emotional response of the people of God as a result of the trauma that they've suffered. And then secondly, assist them in better understanding the problem, as we've sort of been reporting on today, and what the church's response has been in helpful ways, not in denial or excusing, but helping them to feel safer knowing that we really are trying and have tried to address this, and successfully in many ways. And then finally, to continue to invite the laity to be a source of accountability for the larger church, for priests, for religious, and a source of leadership. All the way back in 1992, Stephen Rossetti wrote this, which I think is amazing. The phenomenon of clergy sexual abuse is likely to aid in this balancing of power between Catholic hierarchy and the laity. I believe it to be a positive outcome. The laity needs the clergy to challenge them to a virtuous life, but it is also true that the clergy needs the laity to call them to accountability. The new priesthood will be more responsible and responsive to the people it serves. Instead of looking down at the laity, the clergy and laity will interact eye to eye. The church will not only preach to the laity, it will also listen, right? And this moves the laity towards feeling that they can trust when there's more transparency and more accountability there. In my own work with priests in formation, in religious information, I tell them this, that it's going to be your job as the new priests and the future priests in our church to restore the church's credibility in the institution of priesthood and the celibate life. As a result, you will have to be well-formed. You have to be a well put together human being. And so our formation is really going to focus on that. It's written in the documents, Pastores Dabo Vobis. It's important that the priest should mold his human personality in such a way that it becomes a bridge and not an obstacle for others in meeting with Jesus. It's a beautiful line. Future priests need to be educated to love the truth, to be loyal, to respect every person, to have a sense of justice, to be true to their word, to be genuinely compassionate, to be men of integrity, and especially to be balanced in judgment and behavior. 1996, Pope John Paul II, Pastores Dabo Vobis on the formation of priests. These are great aspirational directions for us in terms of what we require now. And I love this line. In this context, affective maturity, how well is the person put together emotionally, is a significant and decisive factor in the formation of candidates for the priesthood. If they do not have emotional maturity, then they should not be among the clergy. So priests will have to be well-formed. They need to be generous, but with good boundaries. They'll have to be careful and mindful of the trauma that's happened in the church, but not defensive. They need to be aware of the power that their position affords them, but humble and transparent and accountable as they exercise that authority. Finally, priests and religious will have to restore the church's faith in the charism of celibacy, right? By helping parishioners to understand, as Dr. Fothergill was pointing out, that celibacy is not a cause of clergy sexual abuse, but more importantly, that our priests and religious need to live the celibate life in a way that is truly charismatic, right? That draws people, that it helps people to see the value of the celibate life so that anyone will be able to see that celibacy is to be pursued only in the interest of growing in one's capacity for love. The point of celibacy is not to run away from things, not to avoid sexuality, not to be emotionally distant, only to be more emotionally involved in one's capacity to love and be Christ in the world. My last thought. If we went back to thinking about individual victims, and we wonder, why do some victims' lives, why are they destroyed by trauma, and yet others seem to grow and become resilient and really thrive despite the trauma? What are the things that help a person or an institution to grow and be resilient rather than to be crushed? One of the primary factors in the resilience of trauma victims is the presence of a loving other. For the child who's been abused or neglected, if there's a grandmother, an aunt, a family friend who's really taken their side and loved them and pointed out their value, that is one of the most important things in predicting survival and resilience. And I would say that the church is and will continue to be resilient. I'm always amazed at how many chances the church is willing to give us, religious and clergy. And so the church is and will continue to be resilient, I think, because of the lives of many, the majority of clergy and religious who really have demonstrated their capacity for love, who have loved the church and loved the church deeply. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will hear from Father Ken Schmidt.
I'm just going to stay here above the table today. I want to begin with my premise just because you start getting rushed at the end and then you lose track. So here's my premise. Trauma is everywhere, and the church is well positioned, and it has a mission for healing. It's what Jesus did all the time. And his body, the body of Christ, should be known for the same. We should be known for our healing. And right now, personally, to me, it feels like something we're almost ashamed of. Not so much that we denigrate it, we just don't talk about it much. We hide it. We don't want to build up people's hopes. And I think we should be known for healing, and that this is a great opportunity for that to happen. So as I said yesterday, trauma is everywhere, right? So I really want to step away for the moment from clergy sex abuse and talk about abuse and neglect and abandonment and natural disasters and tragedies and illness and death. Trauma is everywhere. In our pews, and the people that aren't in our pews are traumatized. The body of Christ is traumatized. The smallest statistic I've read is that 50% of the American population has a traumatic event in childhood. That's the smallest number I've heard. I've heard 70, I've heard 100. Some people, at least maybe outside in other circles, are now hearing about ACEs, and I have no problem with the ACEs study. It's actually been a great help to open people's eyes to understand how prevalent adult childhood experiences are, adverse childhood experiences, excuse me. The only problem that I have with ACEs is if we land on that as the list, it's a minimum list. As if you're not on ACEs, if you don't have one of those 10 things, then you're okay, that you don't have any trauma, and it's not an inclusive list. So one of the questions that we received was, how has the church responded? As if we don't know. So I'm going to be really brief. Fear, suspicion, avoidance, blaming, finger pointing, even finger pointing at the victims, suggesting that we pray our way out of it. The positive side, I think, where the most effort that I see that's been devoted has been in prevention. We've done a lot to do prevention. I believe on the whole, we've done very little for healing. Especially if it's not just about clergy sex abuse, right? We're not known for healing trauma, and I wonder why. The Dallas Charter in its preamble says this: we commit ourselves to do all we can to heal the trauma that victims, survivors, and their families are suffering, and the wound that the whole church is experiencing. It's a pretty inclusive statement. Now, I understand it's in the preamble, which was written about something specific, so I'm lifting it out of context. I'll totally admit that, but the statement still stands. We commit ourselves to do all we can to heal the trauma. It doesn't say clergy sex abuse, it says trauma that victims, survivors, and their families are suffering, and the wound that the whole church is experiencing. I think it's time that we really put that in front of ourselves. So what we understand is the deep, long-lasting impact of trauma doesn't just grow away. It's not just a matter of time passing. It's not just something that we grow out of. But we also do know how to help people recover. It's not a death sentence. It's not a, I'm sorry, we can't help you because you have trauma. We know how to do it. It can be done. It is hard work. And one of the things that gets in the way of the hard work is the survivor that says, well, why should I have to do all the hard work? I'm the victim here. And it's true. It is totally unfair. There's nothing fair that the victim has to do the hard work. But there is recovery possible if you do the hard work. And so I've given you a sheet just to introduce that to you a little bit. Actually, if you want to go to what's page 3 in here, just make this help you wake up after lunch. Don't start at the beginning, start in the middle. They were passing it out. If whoever has them, they would like a couple copies up here at the table. I'm going to fly through these. But if you look, what each one has is a heading, and then underneath it, it has several bullet points that describes different ways that that particular trait may show up. And the reason I say that is, and what I say to survivors is, I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth, which is, you're all the same, and every one of you is unique. There's a way that you fit under the headings, but when we go through those headings and then say, how are you doing that? And I have a group of 10 people, none of them may be doing it the same way, but in some way, that trait is there. And these aren't in any particular order or ranked or anything like that. So a pattern of out of control and self-injuring behavior. So what shows up? It shows up as addictions. It shows up as habits, repeated behavior, The intention being to avoid feelings, I'll come back to that. Sometimes it's just chaos in life. Therapists know the clients we have that every week it's a new catastrophe, right? I mean, you can barely keep your head of whatever they brought in that week, but you use your attention to deal with the catastrophe. But it's also very effective of avoiding the trauma because you have to deal with the catastrophe, right? So it's off-putting. And self-harming behavior, which is a horrible thing to see. You know, the cutting, the hair pulling, the burning oneself. And one can argue that the addictive behaviors and the repetitive behaviors, that's all self-harming too, but it's a description that we use. Another thing is, and we use the image of a triangle, so think of the 3 points of a triangle. They get stuck in victim, perpetrator, or rescuer roles or behavior. I'm stepping away from roles because role sometimes becomes the label, and I don't want a label, but it's behavior. And so in the original situation, it's pretty easy to describe. Where's the victim? Where's the perpetrator? Where's the rescuer? The rescuer is the person who is in the position to save or listen, believe, support. And as Brother John said, who's the supporter, the lover, the place that was safe to go, that enhances the resilience that exists. But those behaviors become repeated as we move into childhood. Almost like roles, except that you can have more than one, or you can move from one to the next one to the next one. So the victim is the person who in adulthood has the insight of, here we go again, it's always about me, I can never get out of this, things will never change, I'm stuck. There must be something about me that makes it happen to me and not to other people, because it's never happened to my friends. Perpetrator is obviously the person who's responding, who can't manage their feelings except by acting out and doing violence towards others, right? They escape their own feelings of powerlessness by exercising power over someone else. And rescuer then becomes the role of making myself feel better about myself by doing good. This is, in its extreme, it's Messiah complex. It's the ultimate savior. It's the best volunteer in the parish. And I say to pastors when I work with them, be very careful, because you know who the rescuers are in your parish. They're the super volunteers that you can call, and it doesn't matter what you ask of them, they will say yes. And if we take advantage of that, we, the clergy, are the perpetrators and the rescuers, because they can't say no, and we take advantage of them. Because it's so much easier, right? I can make the one call to the super volunteer and I'll get a yes, or I can call 10 people who might say no. In our church, we have to understand that people who have survived trauma didn't have rescuers. That's part of the problem, right? That's why they end up in trauma as opposed to those, as Brother John was describing. What's the difference? Some people recover, right? Some people come out of it. It's not to say that it wasn't a traumatic event, but they come out of it, right? But other people get stuck in the trauma because they had failed rescuers, right? They had the people who shoulda, woulda, coulda done something and didn't listen, didn't believe them, didn't take action. And we have to understand that God is the greatest failed rescuer, right? I'm cleaning it up. I told you I worked in a psychiatric hospital, but where the hell was God when all this happened to me, right? You say God loves me. You say God takes care of me. You say God is watching over me all the time. Then where the hell was God? And in my naivete, I will confess that I used to give them this great, well thought out theological answer, which was in the end a waste of my breath, because they basically said, you don't understand, and I didn't see them again, right? That was my therapeutic mistake. Now my response is, that is a great question, and I will be with you as long as it takes for you to figure that out for yourself. And we can talk about it, we can bat ideas around, but I'm here to be with you as you figure out that answer to the question for yourself. What they have told me later is Remember, it's a different mindset. What they told me later is they expected that when they said that to me, where the hell was God? That I was going to kick them out of my office. That I was going to say, I don't want to talk to you. You know, where's your faith? You know, that was the presumption. Even knowing that they came to me as a priest, it wasn't a surprise, right? But that's still what they expected. They expected to be kicked out because they were asking that question. And so to honor them with, that's a great question. And I'll stick with you as you figure that out. An inability to tolerate feelings or conflicts. So in the model that I'm using, that's the great umbrella. The umbrella is trauma survivors are doing their very best to avoid their emotions. They're too big. They're too overwhelming. When I let myself feel them, they're too uncomfortable. If I act out of them, it's usually a big response that just gets me in more trouble, causes more problems. Go up ahead, go up above to addictive behaviors. You know, in the beginning, I have one drink because it helps me to forget. Then pretty soon I have more drinks to help me forget. Then pretty soon, you know what? Before I even remember, I'll drink. Now I have another problem. So inability to tolerate feelings or conflict shows up in different ways. A pretty obvious way is blunt or numb, right? What does that look like? Today is the happiest day of my life. I have never been as happy today as I am right now. Today is the worst day of my life. I've never been more depressed than I am right now. There's no affect, right? It's just straight line, right? They don't show anything, right? The therapist is saying, well, where's your anger? Where's your grief? Oh, thank God I don't have any of that. I mean, for them, that's attainment. I met with the client the other day. He's 20 years old, and his concluding statement was, my goal in meeting you today was not to show any emotion. And I said, you succeeded, didn't you? He did. But the other way that it shows is in a movement to intense or overwhelming feelings suddenly and rapidly. The old phrase, one of the old phrases was going postal, right? Oh, they were such a nice neighbor. I never saw anything. And then one day they exploded. This is the volcano, right? Nothing, flat, numb, blunt, right? And then it shows. And from their experience, that's exactly what they were trying to avoid, but they couldn't contain it anymore. And so it blows, and then it causes all kinds of repercussions. And what's their safety? To get back to blunt and numb and unfeeling as soon as possible. All that feeling that gets expressed that just got blown up is their proof for why we shouldn't have feelings. Because they're just bad, right? On one extreme, depression, right? Covered up feelings, all the energy's gone because I'm using all my energy to keep my feelings inside. The image that I use is keeping the beach ball underwater while you're out in the lake, not standing on the shore, out in the lake and floating. And you must keep the beach ball underwater at all times, because if you let the beach ball get out of the water, bad things are going to happen. Life-threatening things are going to happen. And for children who don't have that image, right, but they have the safety rule, don't let it come out. Remember that they're concrete thinkers. So they say things like, I'll explode if I let myself feel my anger. They don't mean like I'm going to get really loud. They mean like their body is going to blow up and there's going to be pieces all over the floor. Well, that's a really good reason not to let yourself feel anger and not explode, right? Because you're going to die if you do it. And they don't mean it figuratively or metaphorically. They mean it literally. Panic attacks is another symptom, right? It leaks out. Intense self-blame, feelings of unworthiness, belief that their life is ruined, right? Belief that they were responsible for the original trauma. That's just classic for children. Children are naturally self-centered, and so they believe that whatever happened to them is their fault, right? It's a core belief for childhood trauma. It was my fault, I'm bad, the shame. And then out of that into adulthood continues this irrational sense of something bad happening and it's my fault. It's their default position. My neighbor just got cancer. That's my fault. A house burned down recently. That's my fault. Imagine if you're living the life where every time you hear something bad happens, you pull it back into why you're the fault of that, why you're the cause of that, okay? That's what they're living with, right? And so the negative self-talk, here's just some of the words, right? Bad, failure, unlovable, loser, damaged, insignificant, worthless, right? And so the next one comes out of attachment. Did anybody notice when I start, where am I in my time right now? I forgot. I have my watch sitting here, but I don't remember when I started. But where am I in my 20 minutes?
You started around 2:30, so you
About halfway?
got about
Thank you.
15 minutes.
Okay. All right. Attachment ambivalence. Very briefly. When we're born, we need to be attached in order to survive. Right? We got to have someone there taking care of us because we can't take care of ourselves. We don't say, Susan, congratulations, you have this lovely baby, but there's something wrong with your baby because it can't take care of itself. So you're going to have to take care of it. And I'm really sorry to break that bad news to you, right? Attachment is necessary, right, for survival. And at the same time, we're biologically wired to draw back from pain, to sense harm and pull away, to get away from damage and harm and lack of safety. We're wired for both of those. We're wired for attachment and we're wired for detachment. And now you put a child in the middle of that who's being hurt, right? And all I can tell you from my experience is every child chooses attachment. They don't sit down one day and say, okay, let's get the decision tree out now. Which way am I going to go, right? They choose attachment. And what are they left with? They're left with all the experience that still goes with the detachment. The fear, the anger, the hurt, the hatred, right? All that's still there. But if I'm going to stay attached, what am I going to do with all this? Not feel. Detach, right? It's not safe to feel. And if I start to feel, then I'm going to realize that it doesn't make any sense to stay attached, but I have to stay attached because it's for survival, right? It's a decision for survival. It's unconscious, but it's the decision to survive. But that then continues into adulthood. It continues into adulthood usually as continued attachment. I got to keep these relationships because relationships are for survival, right? I couldn't survive if I didn't have attachment because they still see themselves with the child lens instead of an adult lens, right? And so they keep attachments. And so they stay in violent relationships. They stay in unhealthy relationships. But less often, they go to the other extreme and they now say, you know what, attachment doesn't work. I tried that. You just get hurt. You can't trust anybody. And so we go to detachment, right? I'm going to move to Montana. I'm going to go grocery shopping once a year. And if I see any other people, that's too much, right? The only way to be safe is not to have relationships. Only way to be safe is to keep people at a distance, to keep up the wall, to never let people get close. I can have 1,000 friends on Facebook, but no one knows me, right? Or the third possibility, less frequent, is that I go from one to the other, like a ping pong ball. So I'm in attachment, but attachment's really uncomfortable. So you know what? I'm just going to get out of that. I'm going to get hurt anyway and just be on my own. You know what? I hate being on my own. It is so lonely. I hate my loneliness. So I guess I'm going to go back to, but they're living between the extremes and they're caught instead of understanding that there's all this middle ground. Constantly, if I were to pick one image for helping trauma survivors, it would be get out of the extremes and move to the middle. Get out of black and white and move into the gray. That's just one image. So they have this problem of attaching, and then it shows up in relationships all over the place. Right? Don't have time to go into that, but they're listed.
Trauma survivors say they don't even know what the gray is, and it's the ambivalence is so scary to them. It's like,
Yes.
how do you get to the gray?
Exactly. because they're stuck in the childhood thinking of the black and the white. And that is a way of, it's either this or this. Well, I don't want this, so it has to be this. Ooh, this isn't working well, so it has to be this. I hate this, so it has to be, and finding in them, but they don't know the middle. It's the feelings is the same way. It's blunt or numb or huge and explosive. And when I say to them, let's make that a scale of 1 to 10, 0 to 10 is usually what I use. Let's make that a scale of 0 to 10. And then I say, look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They look at me like I just came in from Mars. There's 9 levels of intensity of feeling. That's not in their experience. It's 0, 100 is more, yeah, it's how they experience it. Yes, yes, yes. So black and white thinking, but other cognitive distortions, we give them a whole list to recognize these periods. So they get caught in child thinking. They get caught in illogical thinking, concrete thinking. So everything, they can't handle metaphor, okay? Everything is literal. They get caught in magical thinking. I remember someone coming in and she said, I realize that my marriage is going to pot. And so I've decided to divorce my husband because that will make him love me again. Right, and see, that's the reaction we have, isn't it? It's like, what? All right, but that's magical thinking, right? It makes perfect sense, and there's some way in their head they can explain why that makes sense. Some other things, just to mention them, suicidal ideation and discerning as we're listening to them. Are they really thinking about it? Do they have a plan? Or is this simply an expression of pain? I wish I were dead. I am in so much pain right now that the only option I see, the only possibility I see when I wouldn't have this pain is if I were dead. Well, that can be an expression of pain, and it can be a real thing that needs to be treated therapeutically and get them to the hospital because they are a threat to themselves. Pathological dissociation is simply another way of handling feelings in the model that I'm working. Right? It is an awareness, a lack of awareness of time, a lack of awareness of space. So I can't remember what I did yesterday. And I'm not talking about all of us who can't remember what we did yesterday. I mean, like, it's not stored. It's like it's not there. And you could get out my calendar and remind me of everything. And all right. It's the basis for what we used to call multiple personality disorder, but now we call dissociative identity disorder, right? It's simply the way that the mind compartmentalizes things in order to handle them or not handle them and avoid them, right?
It's our mind's safety measure.
Yeah.
We check out briefly.
It's very effective. It's very effective. It also causes problems, right? When you're acting like someone else and you don't remember what you did that day because you were acting like someone else. But I remember doing an intake in the hospital, and there's frequently a kind of a tick or a gesture or something when person switches from one altar to another. And I said, who am I talking to? Now, again, if I just said that to you, you'd say, well, I'm Susan. And, you'd kind of say, you forgot my name or whatever. But she said, I'm the angry one. I said, tell me about yourself. And she says, I handle the anger because she can't handle the anger. Right? It's that. And then when she switched again, I said, what were we talking about? And she picked right up with where we were in the conversation before the angry one appeared, right? Because the angry one finished by saying, don't you tell that bitch that I'm here, right? And the other person at that point had no awareness of that. Of course, the goal is to be aware of those different functioning persons and to reintegrate, right?
Integrate the parts of the self, because they are
They're all parts of ourself. And some people, they get kind of like, mystified about that. And I just say, so Sarah, are you married, Sarah? Okay, so do you talk to your husband differently than you talk to your children? There you go. And do you relate to the people at work differently than you relate to your husband? But do you have multiple personality disorder? No. You know how to frame that, how to integrate that, how to hold those different ways and vocabulary and ways of act. We learn how to do that, right? But for the trauma survivor, it's a very functional way of dealing with things in different ways, or that are uncomfortable ways, or that they can't deal with. And so it gets divided up, it gets compartmentalized. So what can we teach? We can teach grounding, being present in the moment, right? As opposed to getting triggered and going into the past. We teach a lot about processing feelings, of managing, articulating emotions, letting people feel, dealing with attachment ambivalence, which then goes into all the different continua of getting out of black and white thinking in relationships, cognitive distortions, dealing with the body, simply telling them and teaching them how to relax their body, because when they're stressed, when the feelings are coming, they don't know what to do with that. Locus of control shift is the fancy words that we use for in childhood believing that they're the center and that it's their fault. And how do we help them then shift and understand the responsibility for that behavior belonged to the perpetrator and not to them, right? And then in adulthood, taking appropriate responsibility for what is theirs and what belongs to other people, rather than automatically assuming it's all me, it's always my fault. The triangle I kind of talked about. We have two pieces of healing that we incorporate at the end of the model. One is interpersonal forgiveness, and the other one is grieving. They're both healing processes. They come late in the process. We don't even mention forgiveness until 9th week, because if they hear that in the beginning, they won't be back for the next week. So you begin to hear what can be done. We have written it as a model for small groups. There are people who do it in individual therapy. There's lots of that stuff around. It's not to say that everything we do is new or unique, but I like it because it's an integrative model, because trauma survivors are a difficult population to work with. They have a lot going on, and it helps us to keep in mind what's really going on as we're moving from issue to issue, which sometimes can feel like, which one are we going to do this week? But to see how it's all fitting together. Yes, time. Yes, I know. Okay, sorry. Yes, so just to know, parishes, dioceses are traumatized too, right? It's not just individuals. Parishes, dioceses, religious congregations are all traumatized, and we need to respond. I'm just gonna hold up my books, and I'm selling them later. I thought Liturgical Press was gonna be selling books, but they aren't, so I'm in the back and I have the books. And there's resources and our information about our programs and whatever on the last page. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I think we are ready to have some questions. We have about 5 or 7 minutes for questions, then about 5 minutes between the panels. So let's see what we can do. Our time is relative. I know there's a lot to talk about. Yes.
Thank you all for a great presentation. Susan, question for you. Others might like to weigh in as well. I'd like to hear more about the term integrated sexuality that you use. So to give you a frame, in moral theology, we might say a married man who evidences integrated sexuality, instead of engaging in self-focused narcissistic behaviors with pornography and masturbation, can be personally present with his wife in the sexual act, fully giving himself to her as a person, body and soul. When you're preparing someone for celibate chastity, aside from saying you don't want them to be fixated on self-focused behaviors that are objectifying to themselves and others, what would be the difference from an integrated sexuality in the vocation of celibate chastity compared to, say, a repressed sexuality? So means, how do you attain one versus the other, and what are the fruits of that to look for?
Great question that probably requires a much longer response. I'm thinking about how we want the men to understand what their sexuality is. First of all, are they attracted to the same sex, to other sex in the middle, and be comfortable with that, whatever that is, even though there's some contradictions with church teachings. So be comfortable with your sexuality so that you're not pushing it away and then acting it out in some way. That would be one piece of integrated sexuality. Other panel members?
I'm not gonna say anything.
I think of that in 3 ways. Similar to Dr. Fethergill, there's a great line in the program for priestly formation that talks about that human formation works on the kind of the threefold model of self-knowledge, self-acceptance before self-gift. And so, I want someone to have good knowledge of themselves as a sexual person and then accept the truth of who they are. But then secondly, if we think about our sexual identity as having lots of kind of components to it, it's our sex, our gender, our orientation, our values and attitudes about sexuality, and then also um, our history of sexual experiences. We want those to be kind of working together within the person so that someone's values and attitudes aren't at odds with who they are. Someone who maybe is same-sex attracted but hates, or thinks that those are terrible, horrible people, and so have a lot of dissonance within themselves, which I think leads to a kind of a lack of integrity within the sexual identity. And then finally, I think about it as, well, this person has their sexuality in its place within their larger personality, where it's receiving the amount of time and attention that developmentally it requires, right? In prepubescent, we're not spending lots of times processing our sexuality. In adolescence, we're spending a whole lot more time because it's new to us and we're trying to figure it out and explore it. But in adulthood, it has its place. It's an important defining part of who we are, but it's not the only defining part of who we are. And the problem, in celibacy is when someone has confused celibacy with just staying in the prepubescent sense of their sexuality. I won't have to deal with it. I'm going to keep it there. I'm not going to devote any time to it. That's not integrated well into the larger kind of part of who they are as a person.
Hi, thank you all for your talk. Brother Farkenheim, am I saying your name correctly?
He's
Sure.
Oh, no.
Falkenhayn?
Then I'm sorry, I mixed you up.
Father Ken.
Ken, I am so sorry. I heard you describe trauma survivors, and a lot of what I came away with from your description is that trauma survivors are fully non-functional human beings. Honestly, it was a little painful for me to hear survivors described that way. So I was just wondering, I know that you respect your clients and the people you work with. So would you be able to offer a few words about, I don't know, just what warrants that respect and the kind of resilience or resources you see as respectable in survivors?
So I'm speaking out of my work with the people who frequently have the extreme. So I don't necessarily see healthy trauma survivors. They're not the ones who are coming to me. They're not the people who are in my program. But what we affirm in them from the beginning is how their skills have helped them to survive. That the skills that the behaviors and attitudes that they're showing were their survival skills, which have got them to this point. But now that they're recognizing that those same things are interfering with their lives. And so we want to add to their toolbox of what can be done differently or what can be changed or tweaked in order to change their lives. In fact, most of them are functioning, not all, but most of them are functioning. Most of them are raising families, are fully employed, and that's not common with all trauma survivors. So most of the people that I'm working with actually are functioning, and we'll find that most of their areas are functioning well, and then they have this area that's not. So I've taken all that into a generalization, but not because every person is awful. Okay.
Did you want to add to that? I want to add to it.
Add, Adam, a moment. So despite all of the things that Father Ken described, I also see that despite all the difficulties, there are functioning people, again, who are married, who have relationships, who have a career, despite all of what might be going on in the inside that the rest of us probably don't see. So they're really amazing people.
I'll just add a little bit to that too. I think often when I'm working with people, it is the case, of course, that you can see the very positive and resilient aspects, and that I'm often saying, I can see these things in you. What we're working for is having you be able to really own them. So it's a kind of what we call a dialectic, where we say this change needs to happen. I know it feels to you like it can't happen, but I can see that it can. And somehow that helps to move people. So the acknowledgement that there really is something there that maybe they just can't own yet is helpful. I think maybe one more question. Okay.
Thank you for saying that, Hillary. I was thinking of people that I love and feeling a little bit the same way as well. So thanks for kind of bringing that up and clarifying that. The other thing, I feel like, I'm sorry, there's just no way to phrase this as a question. So I'm just gonna be honest, it's a comment. I was really concerned with, Brother John Mark, some of the things that you said about recovery from trauma, and specifically this laying out of recovery is possible when the threat is no longer active. And I said before that at least many of the people I know who are survivors of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, the trauma comes from both the abuse and from the way the church has responded to that abuse. And that threat is still very, very active for almost all of them. So I don't think we can say that condition has been met. And for those of us in the church who experience some kind of secondary distress, that threat is not no longer active. And then you spoke about intervention that assists victims in reestablishing trust in the church. And I would say in my work with victim survivors, that is the last thing on my mind, because at least the institution of the church as a whole is not worthy of their trust. And they find, and actually we just had a situation with someone very recently who is a victim survivor who is no longer a practicing Catholic and has established some trusting relationships with a few of us who are Catholic. And that partly helped her feel empowered to reach out to her diocese, where she was treated terribly once again and hurt all over again. And so I want to say that I think our goal should not be to reestablish trust in the church, but to become a church that is worthy of that trust.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that theme of systemic injustice has been running through this, and I think that speaks to it really, really nicely. So we can take a break now, and at what time should we reconvene?
Can I just thank the young woman for sharing that with me? That was directed at me, and I just want to let her know that I heard it and acknowledge it and thank her for her comments.
Yes. Yeah. So time to, yes.
5 minutes?
So 5 minutes, we'll take a break.
And come back.
We'll come back. Thank you again.